Hello and welcome to the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Our guest today is Bryan Pugh, and Bryan Pugh is the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Association of Maryland. Welcome.
Thanks so very much for having me. This is great.
Bryan, I've wanted to talk to you for a very long time. When you compare the number of brain injuries compared with other diseases that are prevalent here in the U.S., there's a crisis going on.
Yeah, it's staggering. I mean, you take a look at, breast cancer and AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and spinal cord injury, and then all combined, those are about 300,000 people a year get affected. In terms of brain injury, it's 2.2 million brain injuries a year, so it's a significant number, And we've had some awareness lately with the advent of, the wounded warriors coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of the sports, in terms of NFL and NHL having concussion protocols and recognizing brain injury as an issue. It's been making the news lately. 60 Minutes ran a piece just 2 weeks ago about encephalopathy and those issues that are happening with long-term cumulative effects of brain injury. But it's a very significant, and the thing that people don't necessarily tend to think about is it's not just the person who's been injured is affected, the whole family is affected, and so that's where it really becomes a community question.
How does your organization address the issue?
Well, the Brain Injury Association of Maryland was founded in 1983 by parents of kids who had brain injuries and really had nowhere to go. Back in the 80s, not a lot was known about it, and what was known about it was not very well distributed. So these parents got together and sort of met and created this organization, and then linked up with other parents throughout the country to become a part of the Brain Injury Association of America. So the Brain Injury Association of Maryland is now the Maryland affiliate of the Brain Injury Association of America. And our primary missions are running an information and assistance hotline, 1-800, 644-6221.
And we'll give that
out again, right, exactly. And then we have our website, we have apps now, we have social media. And so we try to put out information about brain injury prevention, what to do when you have a brain injury and things like that. And so we get around 300 calls a month to our hotline.
So who do you connect, or who are your clients? Are we talking about parents with children with brain injuries, who you just mentioned? Are we talking about soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan? Are we talking about people in car crashes? Who are your clients?
Yes to all those. Just in the last week, I've had a conversation with a parent whose child had a concussion. And they weren't recovering. They needed to know who to contact. I've had a discussion with somebody who had a brain injury several years ago, and then just recently was released from shock trauma after having a motorcycle accident, and is realizing that they're really having struggles and recognizing some of the issues. They're having uncontrollable crying, they're having uncontrollable rages, and this is a father who has a 4-year-old, is sole provider for a 4-year-old, and recognizes he needs to get his act together in order to be able to parent that child. We get calls I got a call from a sister whose brother, she called from Colorado. Her brother lives in Silver Springs. He's no longer able to care for himself. He's had a brain injury about 20 years ago, and he's starting to, lose the ability to live independently. How does that set up? Had another woman call. Her mother's moving in from Massachusetts after being released from a hospital with a severe stroke. And they're trying to figure out, how do I make my house, who do I need to talk to? What services do I need to get in place? How do I get a ramp put into my house? How do I get, bars in my bathroom? Who do I contact for stuff like that? And then we get social workers. I've got a hospital calls me with a social worker. Hey, Bryan, I've got this guy. He's really not falling within the guidelines of needing to stay in acute rehab. We need to find placement for him. He does have some addiction issues. He does have some history of bipolar disorder. But this brain injury really is the thing that's really incapacitating him. How do we find a place for him, because he really doesn't belong here? That's just last week.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's start by talking about children in sports. When it comes to that, are there a lot of resources available? What should parents know? What should this child know?
In terms of the state of Maryland, about 4 years ago, we passed what's come to be known the Casey-Leistat law. It started in Washington and has moved across the country, and it's basically a protocol for people playing sports in school. And the idea is that it requires somebody, if you are injured or show signs of injury during practice or play, they remove you from practice or play, and that you need to be seen by somebody who understands brain injury, not just a doctor. Because so many times we were getting people that were being returned to play with a doctor's note. My dad knows a guy who's a dermatologist, he's got an MD, I can sign a note and get him back in to play for the next game, whatever. So the law requires them, you have to be seen by somebody who understands a little bit about concussion, knows about concussion before you get signed off to return. And then you're gradually returned in on the protocol. That's the Maryland guidelines. In terms of the way that you understand and see that happening, it's going to be the coaches, it's going to be the other players, it's going to be the referees. We have them all, watching and paying attention to that. In some high school systems, we have athletic trainers that are available during practice and play, but it's not consistent. And the one challenge, I think, throughout about this issue is I believe there's only like 8 counties that have athletic trainers at practice and play for certain events. Now, those are going to be the collision sports like football and lacrosse. But you get just as many injuries, or not just as many, but you get many injuries now, at least with girls' sports, cheerleading, wrestling, absolutely. You have personal experience with wrestling. And softball has some injuries, volleyball, basketball, women's lacrosse, and soccer. These are all places where you can get injured.
But it's frightening for parents. What can you allow your children to do?
Well, I think as a parent, and I had 3 daughters who went through softball. We did we were doing the travel softball and all that stuff when my middle daughter had a concussion. I think it's very important for parents to make sure that the coaches understand what they're doing, and there's some follow-up on that, make sure that they've got the training that they need to understand concussion. If there are athletic trainers available, make sure that they're at the practices and the games. Make sure that administration understands that this is an issue and is important, and that may require, some self-advocacy. And then make sure that, the system that you're dealing with, whether it's rec councils, rec sports, whether it's high school sports, that those coaches and refs are getting trained to observe and find these things out. As far as the kids are concerned, and that's really the toughest nut to crack, because if I'm a 17-year-old kid and I'm in the middle of my lacrosse season and I get hit in the head and then I hit a turf field, in a collision, I'm afraid that if I report this, if I say anything about it, I lose my shot at my scholarship, I lose my shot at my starting position, I'm not that guy, I'm not the tough, I want to be tough and rugged, but at the same time, it's a long-term effect. The thing about the law, the Casey Lysett law, that is equally frustrating for us, is that it really is only about sports. Now, that was used as an entree for education, because you have to get certain amounts of the law requires education of the parents and education of the staff and coaching. And then we have the protocols to pull them out and then return to learn, return to play. But just because you don't have a number on the back or your name on a jersey doesn't mean that your concussion is any less impactful. The kid who falls off the skateboard or has the epic fail, as the kids like to say on these YouTube videos, that concussion is just as impactful and just as harmful as the kid who has the head-on tough smack in the lacrosse game, right? It affects their AP, it affects their AP testing, it affects their ability to concentrate in school, it affects their grades, it affects their ability to return to learn. There's a lot of social ramifications that are possible, but those really aren't as addressed either. And so that's the other piece that the parent needs to do, is if your child does start showing indications, showing signs of concussion or showing signs of a brain injury, or they've had one. You've been either you've told or not been told. To be an advocate for them in the school system, and that's a great challenge.
Well, let's talk about military personnel, people who are coming back from Iraq, from Afghanistan, with brain injuries.
Well, what's really interesting about that is I met with the head of the head of the medical piece of the Maryland National Guard. And while, at least in the state of Maryland, while there are people returning with these horrific IED injuries, and these blast injuries, a lot of the brain injuries that they see in the military are car wrecks and motorcycle accidents, because you've got 18, 19, 20-year-old kids doing the same things that 18, 19, 20-year-old kids are doing. You know, they're having the crashes, they're driving too fast, they're not paying attention, they're doing stupid things. So there's a large number of that. The ones that are coming back from IED, and this was the interesting thing when you talk to the people at the Defense Centers of Excellence, DivBIC, down what used to be Walter Reed, NICO, they're talking about how the blast wave for the person on the outside, let's say you're driving in a tank, the person on the outside is horrific. I mean, we know what those can do, both the physical and the damage to the brain. But what they're finding is these concussive blasts are so strong that as they enter the inside, even an armored vehicle or a tank, they accelerate. And if I'm wearing a helmet, they also accelerate within this confined space. So you can actually get a large dose of the concussive blast even if you're inside an armored vehicle. And that's the stuff we're really sort of figuring out. And they're doing amazing research with what are called PET scans, which are essentially MRIs while you're awake, you know, while you're alive. They're like real time. And they put together both a PET scan, an MRI scan, and are able to combine it in a 3D model, and you can start looking and seeing what's happening. And if you think about the brain being lots and lots of little microtubules, and just think about the fact that if you just take something and shake it really hard, those are going to break. Just little bits of break, little breaks here, little breaks there. Maybe not a complete, you know, but that's where this cumulative effect is happening. And so it's the cumulative effect of I survived 9 IED blasts, you know, or I survived 4 really horrific ones, and then I was in a firefight where the building got blown up in front of me or across the street. That cumulative effect is what they're finding. Same thing with football. If I start with Pee Wee football and I move on to travel football and then I move on to high school and college, D1, and then I go to the pros, the cumulative effect of those 10,000 hits, you know, time and time and time again, especially the folks that are doing, you know, the offensive and defensive lines. I mean, some of the statistics on those are crazy. It's just like they're talking about it's the equivalent of a 20-mile-an-hour car crash every single time you hike the ball. You got a 300-pound guy here, a 300-pound guy here. They're hitting each other as hard and as fast as they can, repeatedly. And it can be devastating over time, and then you build it up, and that's why the most shocking thing that's happening is as they're starting to test folks, we're finding younger and younger people with essentially older and older looking brains because of the cumulative effect.
Let's talk about how brain injury affects people with the opioid crisis.
Okay. So what's really interesting, and it's a huge crisis. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. You take a look, I think it's 300,000 deaths in the last year. It's just stunning what's happened. And you find out that 99% of all people that go into surgery get opioids, you know, as part of their pain medication. You take a look at like 4 out of 5 people that are becoming opioid addicts began with an opioid either use or abuse. I mean, the ones that are turning to heroin started with an opioid use or abuse. And we're doing all this good training. We're teaching, I believe it's naloxone is the name of proper town. So they do the naloxone training to teach you how to, you know, you stab it in the heart and they recover. They're finding now, though, it's taking more and more naloxone because the heroin and the opioids are getting stronger and stronger. It's taking more and more naloxone, 3, 4, 5 shots to get people to come around on their overdose. But what people don't really talk about, and the thing that we're trying to raise awareness about, particularly with this opioid crisis, is that an opioid effect is essentially reducing the amount you're breathing. It reduces your breathing. And so that's one of the side effects, and one of the main effects is that you are creating a hypoxic or an anoxic system, you know, in your body, which means you're not getting enough air to your brain, or you're reducing the air to your brain. So what's happening is if I go into an overdose and I stop breathing, that's shutting down oxygen to my brain, or it's reducing the amount of oxygen to my brain, depending on how bad the overdose is. So when I come out of that, if I'm a successful recovery from an overdose, if somebody comes in and saves my life, I'm now an addict, but I also have a brain injury. I have an anoxic or a hypoxic brain injury. And that's the connection that people aren't making, is that all of the successful recovery from an overdose. They saved my life. Your training saved my life. But now I have a brain injury. I have a hypoxic or anoxic brain injury.
And so what are you seeing? What are you doing about this?
So we're trying to raise awareness. We're trying to say that, it's great to have the success to bring these people back to life, but you have to then recover. That begins the story. That begins a new story. You save their life, but you now have somebody who is addicted to drugs who also has a brain injury, and we need to have services around them to help support them, both for the drug addiction recovery and for the acknowledging that they have a brain injury and treat them as such. And so we're trying to work with both awareness and then also maybe try to do some legislation now that it's been declared by the President of the United States as a crisis. It's been declared by the Governor of the state of Maryland as a crisis. There's a great emphasis around this opioid crisis. Try to open people's eyes that it's not just training people and giving them naloxone. It's helping people after they've recovered.
Now, what type of legislation do you think would be effective in this area?
Well, I think one of the things that we're doing, or trying to work towards, is there's a brain injury trust fund. It's not funded in the state of Maryland, but there's a brain injury trust fund which is designed to provide services to people that can no longer provide services. Either they've lost their insurance or don't have benefits, and that's for things like case management. That's really one of the things that we think is the most important. And case management basically means helping you create systems to get your appointments, create systems to get you to your Nar-Anon and your Al-Anon or AA meetings, create systems to get you to your appointments, find transportation for you to get to your different doctor's appointments, get to your therapies, get you the medications you need, make sure you have the medications. Because remember, a brain injury is going to affect the way you think, affect the way you plan, affect the way you already make decisions. And if you're someone who has fallen into addiction, you're already not making great decisions for yourself, great health decisions for yourself. So if we can pay somebody to come in and maybe help you, sort of guide you through the system, because it's a complicated system, and then also help you with your brain injury to make sure to follow up and do these things that are necessary. So with the Brain Injury Trust Fund funded, we can then support case managers to come in and help people that have recovered from a brain injury as a result of an opioid crisis, as a result of a motor vehicle accident. Number one cause of brain injury in the United States is falls, right? 35% of all brain injuries caused by falls.
What types of falls are we talking about?
So this could be anything. The number one group is over 65. So typically for that group and that fall, I stumble over a carpet. I fall down the stairs. I lose my balance. I get up too quickly from the table and sort of lose my balance. I'm taking medication that affects my heart. I'm taking medication that affects my blood pressure. I'm change my medication and I don't realize how that affects me. I'll stand up and fall like that. I'll slip in the bathroom, slip and fall in the bathroom. I mean, your perceptions are a little bit off. Your balance is a little bit off. And you throw any kind of medication on there, then you're going to have those problems. And so that becomes an issue.
So when it comes to diagnosing brain injuries, are the doctors getting it right?
Woo! Well, I'm not a doctor and I don't play one on TV, but my perception is that there's a lot of opportunity for education, because particularly now that people are becoming more aware of the signs and symptoms and are more aware of stroke and more aware of falls and more aware of concussions and want to bring somebody in to get checked out. So it's increased the number of people, I think, that are coming in, which is great. I mean, the awareness is helping us make better diagnosis and better recoveries, but only 10% of people who have actual concussions lose consciousness. And there's still sort of this perception that if you weren't knocked out, if you didn't lose consciousness, you didn't have a brain injury, that's fine. But that's not correct. I mean, 90% of the people that have brain injuries, either mild traumatic brain injuries or traumatic brain injuries, don't lose consciousness. And so that's a perception I think that some doctors believe. The other challenge is that you come in, we did a CT scan on you. We did a CT scan on you and it was all clear, so you're fine. Well, what the CT scan is telling you that I don't have a bleed. I don't have a bleed that CT scan can see on my brain. But that has very little to do with whether I have a concussion or not, because most concussions probably don't show a bleed. Now, is it necessary to do that CT scan to make sure you don't have a bleed? Probably, if it's severe enough. but there may be cases where it's overly unnecessary. As an MRI, even in MRIs that we have nowadays, may or may not detect it. I mean, that's the thing that these advances in the PET scans, the advances in the science is becoming, we're finding smaller and smaller and smaller damage that creates, a bunch of different issues. So I think overall, maybe in the larger cities, the larger ERs, you may find people that kind of get it a little bit. When you get further and further out, are there a lot of pediatricians that could use help? I mean, we've always advocated for trying to, and I think that, if I recall correctly, there's something going on in the medical community where they are trying to get some kind of certification. There are, that I can get specialized training as a pediatrician, as a urgent care doctor, and have specific certifications or training on these kind of things. And I think that's really what's necessary.
I know when I've got sons who were involved in sports, and I know when one of my children had a concussion, we had a pediatrician who sent us elsewhere. She sent us to people who specialize in that.
And I think, there's a lot of science since the 1980s and 1990s when people were starting to looking at this. And there are tools and recoveries.
How did it start? Off air, you were telling me how it began with boxing.
Well, if you take a look at sort of the history of this concussion thing, anecdotally and maybe in some of the literature, there were punch drunk for boxers was a thing. I mean, you heard about punchy or punch drunk. Was a boxer that had, been beaten up so much and had just kind of lost his mind. I mean, we saw sort of a little of that effect with the Parkinson's type syndrome that Muhammad Ali had and he was he was the greatest, and he took enough hits that really started affecting his mind. And so, people that are in the smaller venues, in the lesser venues, in the lesser regulated venues, I mean, boxing started off with no gloves, with fists, So we had that, and then you sort of evolve into the idea of the 1,000-mile stare, from World War II, and sort of shell-shocked, And if you think about it, shell-shocked, if I'm standing around a cannon going off over and over again, that's nothing more than concussive blasts, So so you're getting those concussive blasts going through your brain every single time you launch the cannon. So you have that sort of evolves, and then it becomes more of a science, and then I guess with the advent of these football, the recognition of the football and the CTE and the Sports Legacy Institute that started up, and with the concussion movie and all that took place around that, it really has kind of taken on a little bit more profile. You have Gabby Giffords getting shot, and her recovery with her aphasia and her brain injury, and the rehab that she was able to do with the congressional benefits that she had that were unlike anybody else's benefits. You've had the recovering wounded warriors coming back with these IED injuries and having to figure out what to do with these people, because I sent him away one way and he came back another, or I sent her away another way. And then, you've got the thing that goes along with the brain injury. It can be the depression, it can be post-traumatic stress, and it can be post-traumatic stress from the car crash you were in, because it was so horrific, or the domestic violence that you endured, a beating at your husband, or a beating at your wife, or getting hit in the head with a pan, or being thrown out a window, or thrown out a car. I mean, these are all, or shot. I mean, these are things that all can result in brain injury and have all kinds of different things that go along with them.
Before we run out of time, I want to mention the fact that March, you guys have several things going on.
Well, March is Brain Injury Awareness Month, and we have several things. And March 7th, we have Brain Injury Awareness Day in Annapolis, and the Brain Injury Association will be down there meeting with legislators about brain injury awareness, bringing up these ideas of the opioid crisis and maybe trying to raise awareness about that and maybe some legislation. We're also trying to work to incorporate a question within the transitional. You have a vision test and a hearing test when you transition through school. We'd like to add a brain injury awareness test, or at least a question. Have you lost consciousness, or have you been struck in the head, or have you noticed a change in perception and mood about your child after an event, an injury? To try and include that, so that as we transition from elementary to middle to high school, that will at least have somebody taking a look and say, you know, well, okay, yeah, you're right. Well, you know, they had that car crash with Uncle Milton, and he has been kind of different after that, you know, that kind of thing.
And also, you guys have a big conference?
We do. Also part of Brain Injury Awareness Month, March 15th and 16th, and it's in Timonium at the Radisson, North Baltimore. It's a 2-day conference. We have caregiver tracks, we have brain injury survivor tracks, we have a track for educators and a track for healthcare providers. We offer 13 different professions CEUs, so you can get your continuing education units and come to our conference. We typically have between 375 and 450 people come. It's a great opportunity to learn about brain injury. We've got 65 speakers coming from all over the country to talk about the variety of things.
And to wrap up our discussion, what should caretakers know?
What should caretakers know? Well, I will tell you that it is, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
And if you know one brain injury, you know one brain injury. And so to say, how long do I have to wait? When will they come back? I mean, these are all just sort of, you know, you don't know. But it really is a marathon, not a sprint. And reach out to us, reach out to support groups, find a community, because it's not something you have to do alone.
Well, we'll be giving your information at the end of the program, making sure that everybody knows how to reach you if they need to.
Absolutely.
We've been talking to Bryan Pugh, and he's with the Brain Injury Association of Maryland. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been great.
You've been watching the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Have a great day.